the gentle darkness before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, imagine the first light touching the waters of two great rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates flow through a land that would become the cradle of civilization itself. Their waters, carrying the dreams and destinies of countless generations yet to be born. Here, in this fertile crescent between the rivers, the very foundations of human society would take root in the rich alluvial soil, growing into something magnificent and eternal. The story begins not with kings or armies, but with the quiet rhythm of seasons and the patient hands of farmers who first learned to coax grain from the earth. Around 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age retreated like a gentle tide, small groups of people began to settle along these riverbanks, drawn by the promise of water and fertile ground. They were nomads who chose to stay, hunters who became shepherds, gatherers who became gardeners. Their simple mud brick homes clustered together, forming the first villages that would one day grow into the greatest cities the world had ever known. The land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, as the Greeks would later call it, was a place where necessity bred innovation. The rivers flooded each spring, depositing rich silt across the plains, but the floods were unpredictable, sometimes gentle, sometimes devastating. The people learned to work with the waters, digging the first irrigation channels with primitive tools, creating a network of canals that would transform the landscape into a garden. They learned to store grain in large pottery jars, to domesticate sheep and cattle, to work bronze and later iron. Most importantly, they learned to live together in ever larger communities, developing the first systems of law, trade, and governance. By 3500 BCE, small settlements had grown into true cities, each centered around a massive temple complex called a ziggurat. These stepped pyramids rose from the flat plain like artificial mountains, their summits reaching toward the heavens where the gods were believed to dwell. The largest of these early cities was Uruk, a sprawling metropolis that may have housed 50,000 people, a staggering number for its time. Within Uruk's walls, artisans crafted beautiful pottery, metal workers forged tools and weapons, and merchants traded goods from across the known world. It was in Uruk that humanity took one of its most momentous steps forward. Around 3200 BCE, scribes began making marks on clay tablets, not pictures, but symbols that represented sounds and ideas. This was the birth of writing, mankind's first attempt to capture thought and speech in permanent form. The earliest texts were practical records, lists of grain, counts of livestock, business transactions. But writing would soon evolve to record laws, myths, and the deeds of kings. The invention of writing coincided with the rise of the first true rulers. These were not mere tribal chiefs, but god-kings who claimed divine authority over their subjects. They built palaces to rival the temples, commanded armies, and extended their power over neighboring cities. The age of city-states had begun, each an independent kingdom centered around its patron deity and ruled by its priest-king. One of the earliest of these rulers whose name has survived is Enmebaragesi of Kish, who reigned around 2700 BCE. According to later chronicles, he was a mighty warrior who defeated the neighboring city of Elam and carried off its temple's treasures. But it was another ruler, legendary even in his own time, who would become Mesopotamia's first great hero. His name was Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and his story would echo through the millennia. Gilgamesh ruled Uruk around 2700 BCE, though separating the historical figure from the legend that grew around him is like trying to distinguish between starlight and moonlight on a clear night. The historical Gilgamesh was likely a successful king who strengthened Uruk's walls and extended its territory, but the mythical Gilgamesh became something more, the hero of humanity's first great epic poem. The Epic of Gilgamesh, recorded in cuneiform on clay tablets, tells of a king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, possessed of great strength but also great pride. When his people cried out against his tyranny, the gods created a wild man named Enkidu to challenge him. After a tremendous battle, the two became friends, embarking on adventures that took them to cedar forests guarded by monsters and to the realm of the gods themselves. But when Enkidu died, Gilgamesh was consumed by grief and began a quest for immortality that would ultimately teach him that mortality is humanity's fate, and that lasting fame comes not from living forever, but from accomplishing great deeds. This epic, copied and recopied for over 1,000 years, reflects the worldview of early Mesopotamian civilization. The gods were powerful but capricious, intervening in human affairs, but following their own inscrutable purposes. Humans were their servants, created to provide them with offerings and worship, but capable of great achievements through courage, wisdom, and cooperation. The proper response to life's uncertainties was not despair, but determined action, the building of great works that would outlast their creators. As the centuries passed, the city-states of Mesopotamia grew in size and sophistication. Each developed its own character and specialties. Ur became famous for its merchants and traders, who sailed down the Persian Gulf to India and carried goods across the desert to Syria. Babylon, strategically located where the Tigris and Euphrates flow closest together, became a center of learning and law. Ashur, far to the north, would become the heart of a warrior culture that would eventually dominate the entire region. The early period of Mesopotamian civilization, roughly from 3,500 to 2,334 BCE, is known as the early dynastic period. During this time, the fundamental patterns of Mesopotamian society were established. At the top of the social hierarchy stood the king, who served as both political ruler and high priest of the city's patron god. Below him were the nobles, priests, and wealthy merchants, followed by skilled craftsmen, farmers, and at the bottom, slaves, often prisoners of war or people who had fallen into debt. The economy was based primarily on agriculture, with barley and wheat as the main crops, supplemented by dates, vegetables, and livestock. The surplus produced by farming allowed some people to specialize in other occupations: pottery, metalworking, textile production, trade, and administration. This specialization, in turn, led to innovations in technology and technique that further increased productivity. Religion permeated every aspect of life. Each city had its patron deity, Inanna for Uruk, Enlil for Nippur, Nanna for Ur, as well as temples to other gods. The pantheon was vast and complex, with gods for every aspect of life and nature. They were seen as essentially human in their emotions and desires, but with supernatural powers. They could be generous or cruel, helpful or destructive, often displaying the same petty jealousies and fierce loyalties as their human worshippers. The temples were not just places of worship, but economic centers that owned vast estates, employed thousands of workers, and served as banks, lending grain and silver to merchants and farmers. The priests who managed these institutions were among the most educated people in society, skilled in reading and writing, mathematics, and astronomy. They observed the movements of the stars and planets, developing the first calendars and trying to predict the future through various forms of divination. Warfare was a constant presence in early Mesopotamian life. The city-states competed fiercely for control of trade routes, water rights, and agricultural land. Armies were small by later standards, perhaps a few thousand men at most, but they introduced innovations that would shape military tactics for centuries to come. The Sumerians developed the first organized infantry formations, with soldiers carrying long spears and large shields, advancing in tight formation to break enemy lines. Around 2334 BCE, this world of competing city-states was forever changed by the rise of one of history's first great conquerors. His name was Sargon, and he came not from one of the ancient Sumerian cities, but from the north, where Semitic peoples had long lived alongside the Sumerians. Sargon's origins were humble. According to legend, he was found as a baby floating in a basket on the river, rescued and raised by a gardener. But his ambitions were boundless. Starting from his capital at Akkad, a city whose location remains unknown to this day, Sargon embarked on a series of conquests that would unite all of Mesopotamia under a single ruler for the first time. He defeated Lugal-Zagizi, the king of Uruk, who had recently conquered several other cities and then systematically subdued every major city-state in the region. His armies marched as far as the Mediterranean Sea to the west and the Persian Gulf to the south. Sargon's empire, known as the Akkadian Empire, lasted for over 150 years and represented a new form of political organization. Rather than simply conquering cities and demanding tribute, the Akkadians established a true imperial administration. They appointed governors to rule conquered territories, standardized weights and measures, and created the first professional military force. The Akkadian language, written in cuneiform script, became the lingua franca of diplomacy and trade throughout the Near East, a position it would hold for over a millennium. Under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, the empire reached its greatest extent. Naram-Sin was the first Mesopotamian king to declare himself a god during his lifetime, having his name written with the divine determinative and commissioning statues showing him wearing the horned crown of divinity. His famous victory stele, carved in pink sandstone, shows him climbing a mountain to victory over his enemies, while the stars of the gods shine down upon him. But the Akkadian Empire, like all empires, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The constant warfare required to maintain control over such a vast territory drained resources and manpower. Subject peoples chafed under foreign rule and rebelled whenever they sensed weakness. Around 2154 BCE, the empire finally collapsed, brought down by a combination of internal rebellions, external invasions by the Gutians from the Zagros Mountains, and possibly a severe drought that lasted for several decades. The fall of Akkad ushered in a period of chaos and fragmentation, but from this chaos emerged a renaissance that would become known as the Neo-Sumerian period. The city of Ur, ancient even by Mesopotamian standards, rose to prominence under a dynasty founded by a king named Ur-Nammu around 2112 BCE. The third dynasty of Ur, as historians call it, would restore order to Mesopotamia and create one of the most efficiently administered states in ancient history. Ur-Nammu and his successors were not conquerors in the mold of Sargon, but administrators and builders. They created a centralized bureaucracy that carefully managed every aspect of the economy, from the allocation of irrigation water to the distribution of grain rations. Thousands of cuneiform tablets from this period survive, recording everything from the number of sheep in a particular flock to the wages paid to temple workers. This meticulous record-keeping gives us an unprecedented glimpse into the daily life of an ancient civilization. The most famous ruler of this period was Ur-Nammu's son, Shulgi, who reigned for 48 years and transformed Ur into the greatest city in Mesopotamia. Shulgi was a patron of learning and the arts, boasting in his inscriptions that he could read and write in both Sumerian and Akkadian, play the lyre, and solve complex mathematical problems. He established schools throughout his kingdom, standardized the calendar, and created a new system of taxation based on regular surveys of land and population. Under Shulgi's rule, Ur became a magnificent city of perhaps 200,000 inhabitants. The great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was rebuilt and expanded until it rose in 3 great stages to a height of over 100 feet. Its massive walls, built of fired brick set in bitumen mortar, still stand today, a testament to the engineering skills of the Sumerians. Around the ziggurat clustered temples, palaces, and administrative buildings, while the city's residential districts stretched for miles along the Euphrates. The prosperity of Ur depended largely on trade. Sumerian merchants sailed down the Persian Gulf to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, Magan, Oman, and Meluha, the Indus Valley, bringing back exotic goods, gold, silver, precious stones, ivory, spices, and fine textiles. Overland caravans carried goods to Syria and Anatolia, while the great rivers provided highways for trade within Mesopotamia itself. This golden age of Sumerian civilization produced some of humanity's greatest artistic and literary achievements. The royal tombs of Ur, excavated in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley, revealed the magnificent treasures buried with the kings and queens of the Third Dynasty. Queen Puabi's tomb contained a golden headdress of extraordinary beauty, along with a golden lyre decorated with the head of a bull. Even more remarkable were the signs that dozens of courtiers had been buried alive with their rulers, apparently going willingly to their deaths to serve their masters in the afterlife. The literature of this period reached heights that would not be surpassed for centuries. Sumerian poets composed hymns to the gods, love songs, and epic tales that explored the deepest questions of human existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh reached its mature form during this period, while new compositions like the Lament for Ur would later capture the grief of a people whose world had been destroyed. But even the most efficient administration could not overcome the fundamental challenges facing Mesopotamian civilization. The delicate balance between irrigation and soil salinity that made agriculture possible was constantly threatened by over-irrigation and poor drainage. The canals that brought life to the fields also gradually poisoned them with salt, reducing crop yields and forcing farmers to abandon their fields. Climate change, possibly caused by the same factors that had brought down the Akkadian Empire, brought periods of severe drought that strained the kingdom's resources. External pressures also mounted. To the east, the Elamites in the Zagros Mountains grew stronger and more aggressive. To the west, Amorite peoples from the Syrian desert began infiltrating Mesopotamia in ever greater numbers, initially as peaceful immigrants, but increasingly as raiders and conquerors. The kings of Ur built a great wall across northern Mesopotamia to keep out these barbarous invaders, but walls could not solve the underlying problems that made invasion attractive. Around 2004 BCE, the Third Dynasty of Ur came to a sudden and violent end. The Elamites, led by King Kindatu, invaded from the east, while Amorite forces attacked from the west. The last king of Ur, Ibbi-Sin, was captured and carried off to Elam, where he died in captivity. The great city of Ur was sacked and burned, its temples destroyed, its population enslaved or scattered. The fall of Ur marked the end of the Sumerian period of Mesopotamian history. Though the Sumerian language continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes, much as Latin would be used in medieval Europe, political power passed to peoples who spoke Semitic languages. First the Amorites, then the Babylonians and Assyrians. But the foundations laid by the Sumerians, the concept of urban civilization, the technology of irrigation, the invention of writing, the development of law and government, would endure and evolve under their successors. The period following the fall of Ur, roughly from 2000 to 1600 BCE, is known as the Old Babylonian period. It was a time of political fragmentation, with dozens of small kingdoms competing for supremacy, but also a time of cultural flowering as different peoples blended their traditions with the ancient Sumerian heritage. The most important of these new kingdoms was Babylon, a city that had been relatively minor during the Sumerian period, but was perfectly positioned to take advantage of the new political situation. Located at the narrowest point between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Babylon controlled the trade routes between northern and southern Mesopotamia. The city was ruled by an Amorite dynasty that had established itself there around 1894 BCE. But it was the sixth king of this dynasty who would make Babylon the greatest city in Mesopotamia. His name was Hammurabi, and he ruled from 1792 to 1750 BCE. Hammurabi began his reign as the ruler of a small kingdom centered on Babylon, but through a combination of military skill, diplomatic cunning, and administrative ability, he gradually extended his control over all of Mesopotamia. His conquests were not achieved through overwhelming force, but through patient strategy. He formed alliances with neighboring kings, then betrayed them when it served his purposes. He used marriage diplomacy, economic pressure, and propaganda as effectively as he used armies. Hammurabi's greatest achievement was not military, but legal. Around 1750 BCE, he promulgated a law code that was carved on stone stelae and erected in cities throughout his kingdom. The Code of Hammurabi, as it came to be known, was not the first law code in Mesopotamian history. That distinction belongs to Ur-Nammu, but it was the most comprehensive and influential. The code consisted of 282 laws covering everything from property rights to family relationships, from commercial transactions to criminal penalties. It established the principle that justice should be proportional to the crime, the famous eye for an eye principle, but it also recognized that justice should take into account the social status of both victim and perpetrator. The code was sophisticated in its understanding of human nature and social dynamics, providing for different penalties based on whether crimes were intentional or accidental, premeditated or spontaneous. Perhaps most importantly, Hammurabi's code established the principle that law should be public and accessible. The king declared that he had received these laws from Shamash, the god of justice, and that they applied equally to all his subjects. By having the laws carved in stone and placed in public places, Hammurabi ensured that no one could claim ignorance of the law. This was a revolutionary concept that would influence legal thinking for millennia to come. Under Hammurabi's rule, Babylon became not just a political capital, but a center of learning and culture. The king himself was highly educated, able to read and write in both Akkadian and Sumerian, and he attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen from throughout Mesopotamia. The city's markets bustled with merchants from as far away as India and Anatolia, while its temples and schools preserved and transmitted the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Hammurabi's empire did not long survive his death. His successors lacked his political skill, and the kingdom gradually weakened under pressure from new enemies. To the north, the Assyrians were growing stronger. To the east, the Elamites remained a constant threat. Most dangerously, new peoples were entering the region, bringing with them new technologies and new forms of warfare. The most significant of these new technologies was the horse-drawn chariot. Around 1600 BCE, peoples from the north, the Hittites from Anatolia and the Kassites from the Zagros Mountains, began using horse-drawn chariots in warfare. These fast-moving platforms, carrying archer warriors, gave their users a tremendous advantage over traditional infantry. The Babylonian army, still organized along traditional lines, proved helpless against these new tactics. In 1595 BCE, a Hittite army led by King Mursili I marched down the Euphrates and captured Babylon itself. The city was sacked, and Hammurabi's dynasty came to an end. The Hittites, however, were too far from their homeland to hold Babylon permanently. They withdrew to Anatolia, leaving Mesopotamia to be conquered by the Kassites, a mountain people who would rule Babylon for over 400 years. The Kassite period, from roughly 1600 to 1155 BCE, is one of the most poorly documented in Mesopotamian history. The Kassites adopted Babylonian culture and religion, but they seem to have been less interested in record-keeping than their predecessors. What we do know suggests that this was a period of gradual recovery and consolidation rather than dramatic innovation. The Kassites were skilled administrators who restored order to southern Mesopotamia and maintained diplomatic relations with the great powers of the time, Egypt, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire. They rebuilt the cities damaged during the invasions and constructed new temples and palaces. Most importantly, they preserved the cultural traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, copying and preserving the great literary works of the past. During the Kassite period, the center of innovation in Mesopotamia shifted northward to Assyria. The Assyrians were a Semitic people who had long been settled around the city of Ashur on the upper Tigris River. During the earlier periods of Mesopotamian history, they had been relatively minor players, sometimes independent, sometimes subject to more powerful neighbors. But the political chaos following the fall of Hammurabi's empire gave them an opportunity to expand their power. The rise of Assyria began in the 14th century BCE under King Ashur-uballit I, who transformed Assyria from a city-state into a regional power. His successors continued this expansion, gradually conquering neighboring territories and establishing Assyrian control over the trade routes between Mesopotamia and Anatolia. By the 13th century BCE, Assyria had become one of the great powers of the ancient world, able to treat with Egypt and the Hittites as equals. The early Assyrian kings were formidable warriors who developed new military techniques and technologies. They were among the first to make extensive use of iron weapons, which were stronger and more durable than bronze. They perfected the art of siege warfare, developing battering rams, siege towers, and other specialized equipment for capturing fortified cities. Most importantly, they created the first truly professional army in history, with soldiers who served full-time rather than seasonally, and who were equipped and trained at state expense. Assyrian society was thoroughly militarized. The king was first and foremost a war leader, and his legitimacy depended on his success in battle. The gods were seen as warriors who fought alongside the Assyrian army, and military victory was interpreted as proof of divine favor. This ideology of conquest would drive Assyrian expansion for centuries, ultimately creating the largest empire the world had yet seen. The greatest of the early Assyrian conquerors was Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled from 1114 to 1076 BCE. His reign marked the beginning of what historians call the Middle Assyrian period, characterized by aggressive expansion in all directions. Tiglath-Pileser's armies marched to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, into the mountains of Armenia in the north, and deep into Babylonia in the south. His annals, carved in cuneiform on clay prisms, boast of conquering 42 countries and crossing 23 rivers. Tiglath-Pileser was not merely a destroyer, but also a builder and organizer. He constructed new cities, dug canals, and planted gardens and parks. He collected exotic animals for royal zoos and gathered books and tablets for the palace library. His inscriptions reveal a king who saw himself as a civilizer as well as a conqueror, bringing order and prosperity to the lands he conquered. But even Tiglath-Pileser's mighty empire could not withstand the great crisis that struck the ancient world around 1200 BCE. This period, known to historians as the Late Bronze Age collapse, saw the fall of several major civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece disappeared, the Hittite Empire collapsed, and Egypt barely survived invasions by mysterious sea peoples whose identity remains unknown. The causes of this collapse are still debated by scholars. Climate change may have played a role, as evidence suggests a period of severe drought across the region. The introduction of iron weapons may have made warfare more destructive and destabilizing. The collapse of international trade networks may have undermined the economic foundations of Bronze Age civilization. Whatever the causes, the result was a dark age that lasted for several centuries. Assyria survived this crisis better than most civilizations, but it too entered a period of decline. The kings who followed Tiglath-Pileser were weaker rulers who lost much of the territory he had conquered. For nearly 2 centuries, Assyria was largely confined to its original heartland around the city of Ashur. But this period of apparent weakness was actually a time of internal consolidation and preparation for even greater conquests to come. The revival of Assyrian power began in the 9th century BCE under Adad-nirari II, who began the systematic reconquest of territories lost during the Dark Age. His son, Tukulti-Ninurta II, continued this work, but it was the next king, Ashurnasirpal II, who would begin the transformation of Assyria into the ancient world's most feared military power. Ashurnasirpal II ruled from 883 to 859 BCE, and his reign marked the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian period, the final and greatest phase of Assyrian history. Ashurnasirpal was a king of contradictions, a brutal conqueror who was also a patron of art and learning, a warrior who created some of the most beautiful palaces and sculptures in the ancient world. Ashurnasirpal's military campaigns were characterized by unprecedented savagery. His inscriptions describe in gruesome detail the tortures he inflicted on captured enemies, flaying alive, impaling, burning, and dismemberment. These were not merely the boasts of a cruel king, but deliberate psychological warfare designed to terrorize potential enemies into submission without costly sieges and battles. At the same time, Ashurnasirpal was a great builder and patron of the arts. He constructed a magnificent new palace at Kalhu, modern Nimrud, which became the Assyrian capital. The palace was decorated with enormous stone reliefs showing the king hunting, making offerings to the gods, and receiving tribute from conquered peoples. These sculptures, now in museums around the world, are masterpieces of ancient art, combining technical skill with powerful narrative content. The palace at Kalhu also housed one of the ancient world's great libraries, containing thousands of cuneiform tablets on every subject from literature and history to medicine and astronomy. Ashurnasirpal and his successors saw themselves as the inheritors of all Mesopotamian civilization, and they made systematic efforts to collect and preserve the cultural heritage of the region. Ashurnasirpal's son, Shalmaneser III, continued his father's aggressive expansion. During his 35-year reign, he campaigned almost every year, extending Assyrian power into Syria and Palestine. It was during his reign that Assyria first came into conflict with the Kingdom of Israel, beginning a relationship that would have profound consequences for both civilizations. The Assyrian military machine was now the most sophisticated in the world. The army was organized into specialized units: infantry, cavalry, chariot crews, engineers, and siege specialists. Soldiers were equipped with standardized weapons and armor, supplied by royal arsenals. The army included both Assyrian citizens and foreign troops, including contingents from conquered peoples who served as auxiliaries. Assyrian siege warfare was particularly advanced. They developed battering rams mounted on wheeled platforms, siege towers that could overtop city walls, and specialized techniques for undermining fortifications. No city could long withstand an Assyrian siege, and the psychological impact of their reputation often led to surrender without a fight. Under Shalmaneser's successors, Assyrian power continued to grow. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 744 to 727 BCE, revolutionized the empire's administration and military organization. He replaced the traditional system of tributary states with direct provincial administration, appointing Assyrian governors to rule conquered territories. He also perfected the policy of deportation, forcibly moving conquered populations to distant parts of the empire to prevent rebellions. Tiglath-Pileser's administrative reforms created the first truly efficient imperial government in history. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by an appointed official responsible directly to the king. A sophisticated communication system, using mounted messengers and signal fires, allowed rapid transmission of orders and information across vast distances. Regular censuses tracked population and resources, while a professional civil service managed taxation, irrigation, and public works. The reign of Sargon II, from 722 to 705 BCE, marked the height of Assyrian military success. Sargon conquered the Kingdom of Israel, destroyed the city of Samaria, and deported the bulk of the Israelite population, the famous 10 lost tribes of Israel. He also conquered Cyprus, invaded Egypt, and extended Assyrian control deep into Anatolia and Iran. Sargon was not content merely to rule the empire his predecessors had created. He built a magnificent new capital city called Dur-Sharrukin, Sargon's fortress, near modern Khorsabad in Iraq. The city was laid out on a grand scale, with massive walls, elaborate gates, and a palace complex that covered over 25 acres. The palace walls were decorated with over a mile of stone reliefs depicting the king's victories and the tribute brought by subject peoples. But Sargon's greatest achievement was not military, but cultural. Under his patronage, Assyrian art and literature reached new heights. The palace reliefs from Dur-Sharrukin are marvels of narrative sculpture, showing not just royal triumphs, but scenes of daily life. Farmers working in the fields, craftsmen at their trades, musicians and dancers entertaining at court. These sculptures provide an unparalleled window into ancient Mesopotamian society. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, ruled from 705 to 681 BCE and made Nineveh, the ancient city on the Tigris, his capital. Under his rule, Nineveh became the largest city in the world, with a population that may have exceeded 200,000. Sennacherib surrounded the city with massive walls stretching for 8 miles, pierced by 15 gates and protected by over 200 towers. The heart of Nineveh was Sennacherib's palace, which he called the Palace Without Rival. The palace contained over 80 rooms, many decorated with magnificent stone reliefs. The most famous of these show Sennacherib's siege and capture of the Judean city of Lachish, events also recorded in the Hebrew Bible. These reliefs are remarkable for their historical accuracy and artistic power, showing every detail of the siege from the construction of the Assyrian siege ramp to the impalement of captured defenders. Sennacherib was also a great engineer who solved Nineveh's water supply problems by constructing an elaborate system of canals, aqueducts, and reservoirs. The greatest of these projects was a canal over 50 miles long that brought water from mountain streams to the city. At one point, the canal crossed a valley on a stone aqueduct, one of the earliest examples of this engineering technique. The reign of Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon, from 681 to 669 BCE, saw the Assyrian Empire reach its greatest territorial extent. Esarhaddon conquered Egypt, making Assyria the ruler of virtually the entire civilized world. From the Persian Gulf to the cataracts of the Nile, from the mountains of Iran to the coasts of the Mediterranean, all acknowledged Assyrian supremacy. But it was under the last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, that the empire's cultural achievements reached their zenith. Ashurbanipal ruled from 669 to 627 BCE and was perhaps the most learned monarch in ancient history. He could read and write in both Akkadian and Sumerian, and he took a personal interest in scholarship and literature. Ashurbanipal's greatest achievement was the creation of the world's first systematic library at his palace in Nineveh. He sent scholars throughout the empire to collect copies of important texts, from the great literary works of the past to practical manuals on subjects like medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. The library eventually contained over 30,000 tablets, representing the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization. It was in Ashurbanipal's library that the Epic of Gilgamesh was preserved in its most complete form. The tablets found there have provided scholars with most of their knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian literature, science, and religion. In a very real sense, Ashurbanipal's library saved the intellectual heritage of the ancient world for posterity. Despite its cultural achievements, the Assyrian Empire contained the seeds of its own destruction. The constant warfare required to maintain control over such a vast territory exhausted the empire's resources and manpower. The policy of deportation, while effective in preventing rebellions, created a patchwork of displaced peoples with no loyalty to their Assyrian rulers. The empire's harsh rule bred resentment among subject peoples who longed for independence. The empire's administrative efficiency, which had been a source of strength, became a weakness as it made the system dependent on continuous communication and control from the center. When that center weakened, the entire system could collapse with surprising speed. The Assyrian army, for all its professional skill, was spread thin across an enormous territory and could not be everywhere at once. The end came with shocking suddenness. In 626 BCE, Babylon rebelled under Nabopolassar, a Chaldean leader who established a new dynasty there. In 625 BCE, the Medes, an Iranian people, joined the rebellion. The Assyrian army, weakened by decades of continuous warfare and internal strife following Ashurbanipal's death, could not suppress both rebellions simultaneously. In 614 BCE, the Medes captured and destroyed Ashur, the original Assyrian capital and the religious heart of the empire. 2 years later, in 612 BCE, a combined force of Babylonians and Medes besieged Nineveh itself. The great city, which had seemed impregnable, fell after a siege of only 3 months. The palace where Ashurbanipal had assembled his great library was burned, and the cuneiform tablets that contained the wisdom of ages were buried under the rubble, not to be discovered again until the 19th century CE. The last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, fled to Haran in northern Mesopotamia, where he attempted to maintain a rump state with Egyptian support. But in 609 BCE, Haran too fell to the Babylonians, and the Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the ancient world for 3 centuries, vanished from history as if it had never been. The fall of Assyria marked the beginning of a new era in Mesopotamian history. The Babylonians, now free from Assyrian rule, quickly established themselves as the dominant power in the region. Under Nabopolassar and his more famous son Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon experienced a renaissance that would make it the most famous city in the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled from 605 to 562 BCE and was one of history's great builder kings. He transformed Babylon into a wonder of the ancient world, constructing magnificent palaces, temples, and fortifications that amazed visitors from across the known world. The city's most famous feature was the Ishtar Gate, a massive structure decorated with glazed brick reliefs of dragons and bulls in brilliant blues and yellows. The palace complex that Nebuchadnezzar built covered over 500 acres and included the famous Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to ancient sources, these gardens were built as a gift for his wife, who missed the green hills of her homeland. The gardens were said to rise in terraces, supported by arched vaults, with an elaborate system of pumps and channels bringing water from the Euphrates to irrigate exotic plants and trees from across the empire. Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a builder, but also a conqueror who extended Babylonian power throughout the Levant. His armies besieged and captured Jerusalem twice, in 597 and 586 BCE, destroying Solomon's temple and carrying the Jewish elite into exile in Babylon. This Babylonian captivity would have profound consequences for the development of Judaism and, through it, for the entire Western world. The exiled Jews found themselves in a cosmopolitan city where peoples from across the known world mingled in the markets and temples. Some, like the prophet Daniel, rose to high positions in the Babylonian administration. Others, like the prophet Ezekiel, used their exile as an opportunity to develop new theological concepts that would reshape their religion. The experience of exile forced the Jews to grapple with fundamental questions about their relationship with God and their identity as a people, leading to innovations in religious thought that would echo through the centuries. During this Neo-Babylonian period, astronomy and mathematics reached new heights of sophistication. Babylonian astronomers created detailed records of planetary movements, developed sophisticated mathematical models to predict eclipses, and established the zodiac system that is still used today. Their mathematical achievements included the development of a sophisticated place value number system and methods for solving complex algebraic problems. The prosperity of Neo-Babylonian civilization was built on trade as much as conquest. Babylon sat at the center of trade routes, connecting India and Central Asia with the Mediterranean world. Merchants from the city carried goods across the known world, while foreign traders flocked to Babylon's markets. The city's wealth was legendary, inspiring both admiration and envy among its neighbors. But the Neo-Babylonian Empire, like its Assyrian predecessor, proved to be relatively short-lived. The last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, who ruled from 556 to 539 BCE, was an eccentric ruler more interested in archaeology and religion than in governing. He spent years away from Babylon, excavating ancient sites and worshipping the moon god Sin, leaving the administration of the empire to his son Belshazzar. Nabonidus's neglect of traditional religious duties alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, Babylon's patron god. His absence from the capital weakened the central administration, just as new threats were emerging on the empire's borders. To the east, a new power was rising that would soon reshape the entire ancient world: the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus II of Persia was a ruler of extraordinary vision and ability, who between 559 and 530 BCE created the largest empire the world had yet seen. Starting from a small kingdom in the mountains of Iran, he conquered the Lydians in Asia Minor, the Medes in Iran, and numerous other peoples before turning his attention to Babylon. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE was remarkably bloodless. The city's priests, alienated by Nabonidus's religious policies, welcomed Cyrus as a liberator. The Persian army entered Babylon without a battle, and Cyrus was proclaimed king in the traditional Mesopotamian manner. One of his first acts was to allow the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, earning him the title of Messiah, Anointed One, in Hebrew scripture. Cyrus's treatment of Babylon set the pattern for Persian rule throughout their empire. Unlike the Assyrians, who had imposed their culture and religion on conquered peoples, the Persians allowed local traditions to continue. They saw themselves as the inheritors of the ancient Mesopotamian tradition of kingship, and they carefully maintained traditional religious observances and administrative practices. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia remained an important and prosperous part of a vast empire that stretched from India to Egypt. The region was organized as the satrapy of Babylonia, governed by Persian-appointed officials, but maintaining its traditional economic and social structures. The cuneiform writing system continued to be used for legal and commercial documents, while Aramaic became the lingua franca of administration. The Persian period saw continued innovation in astronomy and mathematics. Babylonian astronomers working under Persian patronage made observations of unprecedented accuracy, developing mathematical models that could predict planetary positions decades in advance. The astronomical texts from this period, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, represent some of the most sophisticated mathematical work of the ancient world. Religious life also flourished under Persian rule. The Persians' tolerant religious policy allowed ancient Mesopotamian cults to continue alongside newer religions. The worship of traditional gods like Marduk and Nabu continued in renovated temples, while new ideas from Persia, such as Zoroastrianism, began to influence local religious thought. The Persian Empire itself was transformed by its conquest of Mesopotamia. The administrative techniques developed by centuries of Mesopotamian rulers, provincial government, regular taxation, professional military forces, and efficient communication systems were adopted and refined by the Persians. The cultural achievements of Mesopotamia, its literature, science, and art, were preserved and transmitted throughout the Persian realm. For over 2 centuries, Mesopotamia remained a peaceful and prosperous part of the Persian Empire. Cities were rebuilt and expanded, trade flourished, and the arts continued to develop. But this tranquil period was shattered in 334 BCE, when a young Macedonian king named Alexander crossed the Hellespont with an army of 35,000 men, beginning a conquest that would change the ancient world forever. Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire was swift and decisive. After victories at the Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, he captured the Persian capital of Persepolis and proclaimed himself King of Kings. In 331 BCE, Alexander entered Babylon in triumph. But unlike previous conquerors, he showed remarkable respect for the city's traditions and religion. Alexander participated in traditional Babylonian religious ceremonies, made offerings to Marduk, and ordered the restoration of temples that had fallen into disrepair. He planned to make Babylon one of the capitals of his vast empire, beginning the construction of a new palace and a massive tomb for himself. But these grand plans were cut short when Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, perhaps of fever, perhaps of poison, at the age of only 32. Alexander's death plunged his empire into chaos as his generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, fought for control of different regions. Mesopotamia eventually fell to Seleucus, one of Alexander's bodyguards, who established the Seleucid Empire with its capital at Seleucia on Tigris, a new city built near ancient Babylon. The Seleucid period, lasting from 312 to 141 BCE, was a time of cultural synthesis as Greek and Mesopotamian traditions blended to create something new. Greek became the language of administration and high culture, while Aramaic remained the language of trade and daily life. Traditional cuneiform writing gradually declined, though it continued to be used for religious and scholarly purposes. The Seleucids founded new cities throughout Mesopotamia, built in the Greek style with theatres, gymnasiums, and agoras. But they also maintained traditional Mesopotamian institutions, continuing to support ancient temples and observing traditional festivals. This cultural blending produced remarkable innovations in art, literature, and science. Mesopotamian astronomy reached its highest development during the Seleucid period. Astronomers working in Babylon and Seleucia made observations of unprecedented precision, developing mathematical models that could predict planetary positions with remarkable accuracy. Their work influenced Greek astronomy and, through it, the later development of astronomy in the Islamic world and medieval Europe. The most famous Mesopotamian astronomer of this period was Seleucus of Seleucia, who lived in the 2nd century BCE. He was one of the few ancient astronomers to advocate the heliocentric theory, arguing that the Earth orbited the Sun rather than the reverse. Though his ideas were not widely accepted in antiquity, they anticipated the discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo by over a millennium. Religious life during the Seleucid period was characterized by the same synthesis of traditions seen in other areas. Traditional Mesopotamian gods continued to be worshipped, but they were often identified with Greek deities. Marduk became associated with Zeus, Nabu with Apollo, and Ishtar with Aphrodite. New religious movements also emerged, including various mystery cults that promised salvation to initiates. The most significant religious development was the rise of apocalyptic literature, religious texts that claimed to reveal the divine plan for history and the coming end of the world. These texts, influenced by Persian, Jewish, and Mesopotamian traditions, described cosmic battles between good and evil, the judgment of the dead, and the establishment of a divine kingdom on earth. Though few of these texts survive, their influence on later Jewish and Christian thought was profound. The Seleucid Empire gradually weakened over time, losing territory to the rising power of Rome in the west and the Parthians in the east. In 141 BCE, the Parthians, an Iranian people who had established an empire based in modern Iran, conquered Mesopotamia and incorporated it into their realm. The Parthian period, lasting from 141 BCE to 224 CE, saw Mesopotamia become a frontier region between the Parthian and Roman empires. The two great powers fought numerous wars in the region, with cities changing hands repeatedly. Despite this political instability, economic and cultural life continued much as before. The Parthians, like the Persians before them, were tolerant rulers who allowed local traditions to continue. Cuneiform writing experienced a brief revival during this period, with some temples producing new religious texts in the ancient script. Greek culture also continued to flourish, particularly in the cities founded during the Seleucid period. Trade remained important during the Parthian period, as Mesopotamia lay along the Silk Road connecting China with the Roman Empire. Merchants from across the known world gathered in cities like Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital built on the Tigris near ancient Babylon. The region's wealth from trade helped it maintain its cultural vitality despite political upheavals. Religious life during the Parthian period was remarkably diverse. Traditional Mesopotamian cults continued alongside Greek religious practices, Persian Zoroastrianism, and newer movements like Manichaeism. Jewish communities, descended from those exiled by Nebuchadnezzar, remained important, particularly in Babylon itself. Christianity also began to spread in the region during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, establishing communities that would survive for many centuries. The Parthian Empire was eventually overthrown by the Sassanids, another Iranian dynasty, in 224 CE. The Sassanid period, lasting until the Arab conquest in 637 CE, was the final chapter in the pre-Islamic history of Mesopotamia. The Sassanids, like their predecessors, maintained many traditional practices while introducing their own innovations. Under Sassanid rule, Ctesiphon became one of the largest cities in the world, rivaling Constantinople and Chang'an. The city was famous for its magnificent palace, with its enormous barrel-vaulted audience hall that could hold thousands of people. The palace was decorated with elaborate stucco work and wall paintings that combined Persian, Greek, and Mesopotamian artistic traditions. The Sassanid period saw the final flowering of ancient Mesopotamian culture. Traditional religious practices continued in many temples, though Zoroastrianism became the official religion of the empire. Scholarship also flourished, with schools in cities like Baghdad and Nisibis becoming famous throughout the ancient world for their teaching of philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. The end of ancient Mesopotamian civilization came not with conquest, but with cultural transformation. In 637 CE, Arab armies conquered the Sassanid Empire, bringing Islam to Mesopotamia. The new religion, with its emphasis on monotheism and its rejection of traditional polytheistic practices, gradually transformed the religious landscape of the region. The Arabic language replaced Aramaic as the language of administration and daily life, while the Arabic script replaced the various writing systems that had been used in Mesopotamia for millennia. The last cuneiform texts were written in the 1st century CE, ending a tradition of writing that had lasted for over 3,000 years. Yet even as the external forms of Mesopotamian civilization disappeared, its influence continued to be felt. Islamic scholars preserved and transmitted much ancient Mesopotamian learning, particularly in astronomy and mathematics. The techniques of irrigation and agriculture developed in ancient Mesopotamia continue to be used. The legal traditions established by Hammurabi and his successors influenced Islamic law. The epic literature of ancient Mesopotamia, while no longer copied, had already influenced Greek and Hebrew literature through which it would reach the modern world. The great cities of ancient Mesopotamia gradually declined after the Arab conquest. Baghdad, founded by the Abbasid caliphs in the 8th century CE, became the new center of the region, while the ancient cities slowly crumbled into ruin. Babylon, once the greatest city in the world, was abandoned by the 11th century. Nineveh and Ashur became tells, artificial hills marking the sites of ancient settlements. For over 1,000 years, the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia lay forgotten beneath the desert sands. Travelers occasionally noted the strange mounds that dotted the landscape, but few suspected that they marked the sites of the world's first cities. It was not until the 19th century that European archaeologists began to excavate these sites, gradually revealing the magnificent civilization that had flourished there. The rediscovery of ancient Mesopotamia was one of the great archaeological adventures of the modern era. In 1845, Austin Henry Layard began excavating at Nimrud, uncovering the magnificent palaces of the Assyrian kings. Paul Emile Botta was simultaneously working at Khorsabad, revealing Sargon's capital. In the 1870s, George Smith made headlines around the world when he discovered and translated the Babylonian flood story, showing remarkable parallels to the biblical account of Noah. The excavation of these sites required enormous effort and ingenuity. The palaces and temples of ancient Mesopotamia were built of mud brick, which had hardened over the millennia into concrete-like masses. Excavators had to carefully separate architectural features from the surrounding debris, often working in temperatures that soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The rewards were spectacular. Room after room revealed magnificent stone sculptures, intricate ivory carvings, golden jewelry, and thousands of cuneiform tablets. The palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh alone yielded over 20,000 tablets, including the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The royal tombs at Ur contained treasures that rivaled those found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. Perhaps even more important than the art and treasures were the written records that emerged from the excavations. Cuneiform tablets provided an unprecedented window into ancient life, recording everything from royal annals to business contracts, from religious hymns to mathematical exercises. Scholars gradually learned to read cuneiform, revealing the voices of people who had lived thousands of years ago. The decipherment of cuneiform was a triumph of 19th century scholarship. The script was incredibly complex, with hundreds of signs that could represent syllables, words, or concepts. Many signs had multiple meanings depending on context. The breakthrough came when scholars realized that many tablets were bilingual, with the same text written in both Sumerian and Akkadian. By comparing these parallel texts, they gradually worked out the meaning of individual signs. As more tablets were discovered and translated, the full scope of Mesopotamian achievement became clear. Here was the world's first urban civilization, the inventors of writing, the creators of the first legal codes, the builders of the first empires. Their literature included not only the Epic of Gilgamesh, but hundreds of other works, creation myths, wisdom literature, love poetry, and historical chronicles. Their scientific achievements were equally impressive. Mesopotamian mathematicians developed sophisticated methods for solving algebraic and geometric problems. Their astronomers created accurate calendars, predicted eclipses, and mapped the movements of the planets. Their physicians compiled detailed medical texts describing symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments for hundreds of diseases. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization revolutionized our understanding of human history. Before the excavations began, most Europeans believed that civilization had begun with the Greeks and Romans. The discovery of sophisticated urban societies that had flourished thousands of years before classical antiquity forced a complete revision of historical chronology. More importantly, the Mesopotamian discoveries revealed the deep roots of many institutions and ideas that we consider fundamental to civilization. The concept of written law, the idea of royal authority, the practice of urban planning, the techniques of organized warfare, all of these can be traced back to ancient Mesopotamia. The influence of Mesopotamian civilization extended far beyond its geographical boundaries and chronological limits. Through trade and conquest, Mesopotamian ideas spread throughout the ancient world. The Greeks learnt mathematics and astronomy from Babylonian scholars. The Persians adopted Mesopotamian administrative techniques. The Hebrews borrowed legal concepts and literary forms. Even today, we live with the legacy of ancient Mesopotamia. Our mathematical system is based on the Mesopotamian invention of place value notation. Our calendar derives from Mesopotamian astronomical observations. Our legal systems trace their ancestry back to the Code of Hammurabi. Our literature still echoes themes first explored in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story of Mesopotamian civilization is ultimately a story about the human capacity for innovation and adaptation. Faced with the challenges of living in a difficult environment, the peoples of ancient Mesopotamia developed solutions that not only allowed them to survive, but to flourish. They created cities where none had existed before, devised systems of writing and law, built monumental architecture, and produced works of art and literature that still move us today. Their achievements were not accomplished easily or quickly. It took thousands of years for the small farming villages of the early Neolithic period to evolve into the great cities of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Each generation built upon the achievements of its predecessors, gradually accumulating the knowledge and techniques that made their civilization possible. The process was not always smooth or peaceful. Wars destroyed cities and scattered populations. Natural disasters disrupted trade and agriculture. Political upheavals brought down dynasties and empires. Yet through all these crises, the essential elements of Mesopotamian civilization, urban life, written communication, organized government, and sophisticated technology, survived and evolved. The final chapter of ancient Mesopotamian history reminds us that no civilization, however great, is permanent. The mighty empires that once ruled from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean eventually fell to new powers with different ideas and different ways of life. The cities that had stood for millennia were abandoned and forgotten. The languages that had been spoken for thousands of years died out, replaced by new tongues. Yet death and abandonment were not the end of the story. The ideas and institutions created in ancient Mesopotamia outlived the civilization that gave them birth. They were adopted, adapted, and transmitted by successor cultures, eventually becoming part of the common heritage of humanity. In this sense, ancient Mesopotamia never truly died, but was transformed and absorbed into the larger stream of human history. Today, as we face our own challenges and uncertainties, the story of ancient Mesopotamia offers both inspiration and warning. It shows us what human beings can accomplish when they work together to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. It reminds us that progress is possible, but not inevitable, that achievements can be lost as well as gained, and that the preservation of civilization requires constant effort and vigilance. The ruins of ancient Mesopotamia still stand in the desert, weathered by wind and rain but not entirely destroyed. The great ziggurat of rises from the plain much as it did 4,000 years ago. The walls of Babylon, though fallen, still mark the boundaries of what was once the world's greatest city. These monuments serve as reminders of human achievement and human frailty, of the civilizations that rise and the civilizations that fall. In the quiet of the desert night, when the stars shine down on the ancient tell mounds as they have for countless centuries, it is possible to imagine the voices of the past, the merchants haggling in the marketplace, the scribes copying texts in the temple school, the poets reciting the deeds of heroes, the astronomers calculating the movements of the planets. These voices have been silenced by time, but their words and deeds have echoed through the ages, shaping the world we inhabit today. The story of ancient Mesopotamia is our story too, for we are all heirs to the civilization that began between the rivers. In our cities and laws, our writing and literature, our science and technology, we carry forward the legacy of those ancient peoples who first dared to imagine that human beings could create something greater than themselves. Their great experiment in civilization continues in our own time, and its ultimate outcome remains like theirs, unwritten in the stars. Yet to understand the full magnitude of Mesopotamia's gift to humanity, we must trace with patient care the countless threads that connect their world to ours. When the morning sun rises over a modern city, illuminating glass towers that scrape the sky, we see the distant descendants of those first ziggurats that rose from the Mesopotamian plain. The principle remains unchanged: human beings working together to create structures that dwarf the individual, monuments to collective ambition and shared purpose. The urban planning that guides the growth of contemporary cities echoes techniques first developed by the architects of and Babylon. The grid system that organizes city blocks, the zoning that separates residential from commercial districts, the infrastructure of water and waste management. All these concepts have their roots in the administrative genius of ancient Mesopotamian rulers who learned to manage populations larger than any the world had previously seen. In the quiet hours before dawn, when delivery trucks navigate empty streets according to predetermined routes, they follow a pattern established by the merchant caravans that once carried goods along the royal road of the Persian Empire. The logistics of modern commerce, the tracking of inventory, the scheduling of shipments, the management of supply chains, all descend from techniques pioneered by Mesopotamian traders who first learned to move goods efficiently across vast distances. The bills of lading that accompany every shipment, the contracts that govern every transaction, the insurance policies that protect against loss. These documents are the direct descendants of the cuneiform tablets that recorded business dealings in ancient Babylon. The fundamental principle of commercial law, that agreements should be written down and witnessed, was established in the courts of Hammurabi and refined by generations of Mesopotamian jurists. When a modern banker calculates compound interest on a loan, she uses mathematical principles first worked out by Babylonian mathematicians over 2 millennia ago. The place value number system that makes complex calculations possible, the algebraic methods for solving equations, the geometric techniques for measuring land and calculating volumes, all were gifts from the scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia. The computer programmers who write the code that runs our digital world work with binary logic, systems of ones and zeros that echo the fundamental insight of Mesopotamian thinkers who first understood that complex ideas could be broken down into discrete, manipulable units. The cuneiform script, with its combinations of simple marks to create complex meanings, was humanity's first information technology, a predecessor to every system of data storage and transmission that followed. In hospitals around the world, physicians examine patients using diagnostic techniques that can be traced back to the medical texts of ancient Babylon. The practice of taking detailed medical histories, of systematically examining symptoms, of prescribing treatments based on empirical observation rather than pure superstition. All these methods were pioneered by Mesopotamian healers who first approached medicine as a rational discipline. The astronomical observations that guide our space missions and satellite communications rest on foundations laid by the stargazers of ancient Babylon. When modern astronomers calculate the orbit of a spacecraft or predict the timing of an eclipse, they use mathematical models that have their ultimate origin in the patient observations of Mesopotamian priests who tracked the movements of celestial bodies night after night, year after year, century after century. The calendar that organizes our daily lives, with its division of the year into months, the month into weeks, the day into hours, preserves the astronomical wisdom of ancient Mesopotamia. The 7-day week, observed by billions of people around the world, was their invention. The 24-hour day, the 60-minute hour, the 60-second minute, all reflect the base 60 number system developed by Mesopotamian mathematicians. Even our understanding of time itself bears the mark of Mesopotamian thought. The concept of historical time, the idea that events unfold in a meaningful sequence, that the present grows out of the past and shapes the future, was first articulated by Mesopotamian chroniclers who began keeping systematic records of political and religious events. Before their work, human societies lived in a kind of eternal present, where myths and legends provided the only framework for understanding the past. The literature that shapes our imagination draws continuously from Mesopotamian sources. The Epic of Gilgamesh established narrative patterns that still guide storytelling today. The hero's journey, the quest for immortality, the friendship that transcends death, the wisdom that comes through suffering. Every modern story of friendship tested by adversity, every tale of a hero's search for meaning, every exploration of mortality and legacy echoes the themes first explored in the tablets found at Nineveh. The flood story that appears in cultures around the world can be traced back to Mesopotamian origins. The tale of Utnapishtim, who survived the Great Deluge by building an ark, became the prototype for similar stories in Hebrew, Greek, Indian, and countless other traditions. This narrative of divine judgment, human survival, and cosmic renewal has become one of humanity's most enduring myths, appearing in new forms in each generation. Religious concepts that continue to shape human spirituality first emerged in the temples of ancient Mesopotamia. The idea of divine law, that gods establish moral principles that humans must follow, was articulated by Mesopotamian theologians long before it appeared in other traditions. The concept of personal responsibility for sin, the possibility of divine forgiveness, the hope of life after death. All these ideas have Mesopotamian roots. The practice of monotheism itself, which would transform human religious consciousness, developed partly through interaction with Mesopotamian religious thought. The Hebrew prophets who proclaimed the unity of God did so while living in exile in Babylon, surrounded by the sophisticated theological discussions of Mesopotamian priests. Their revolutionary insight that one God ruled all nations and all peoples emerged from their encounter with Mesopotamian universalism. The architectural legacy of Mesopotamia extends far beyond the obvious influence of ziggurats on later stepped pyramids and temple towers. The principle of monumental architecture, buildings designed not merely for function, but for symbolic impact, was their creation. Every cathedral spire that reaches toward heaven, every government dome that proclaims authority, every monument that commemorates achievement, follows patterns established by the builders of ancient Mesopotamia. The decorative arts that beautify our public spaces trace their lineage to Mesopotamian workshops. The technique of glazed ceramics, which gives color and brilliance to architectural decoration, was perfected by the artisans who created the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. The art of narrative relief sculpture, which tells stories through sequences of carved images, was pioneered by the artists who decorated Assyrian palaces. Even the gardens that provide refuge from urban stress descend from Mesopotamian prototypes. The hanging gardens of Babylon, whether they existed in the form described by ancient writers or not, represented a revolutionary concept: the artificial creation of natural beauty in an urban environment. Every city park, every rooftop garden, every green space designed to bring nature into the built environment follows this ancient precedent. The educational systems that transmit knowledge from one generation to the next were first organized in Mesopotamian temple schools. The idea that society should invest resources in teaching children to read and write, that knowledge should be systematically preserved and transmitted, that education should extend beyond practical skills to include literature, history, and philosophy. All these concepts were developed by Mesopotamian educators. The libraries that preserve human knowledge are the direct descendants of Ashurbanipal's great collection at Nineveh. The principle that information should be systematically gathered, organized, and made available for future use was his innovation. Every modern library, every database, every archive follows organizational principles first established in ancient Mesopotamia. The scientific method itself, the systematic observation of natural phenomena, the formation of hypotheses, the testing of theories against evidence, emerged from practices developed by Mesopotamian scholar priests. Their careful observation of astronomical phenomena, their systematic recording of data, their attempts to find mathematical patterns in natural events, laid the groundwork for all subsequent scientific inquiry. The technology that shapes our modern world often reflects principles first discovered in ancient Mesopotamia. The wheel, perhaps humanity's most important mechanical invention, was their creation. The principle of the lever, which underlies countless modern machines, was first understood by Mesopotamian engineers. The techniques of metallurgy that make possible everything from kitchen utensils to spacecraft were pioneered in Mesopotamian workshops. Even more fundamental than these specific technologies was the Mesopotamian insight that human beings could systematically improve their material condition through the application of intelligence and effort. Before their time, most human societies accepted their technological limitations as natural and unchangeable. The Mesopotamians were the first to believe that problems could be solved, that techniques could be improved, that the future could be better than the past. This technological optimism, which became a defining characteristic of human civilization, was born in the workshops and laboratories of ancient Mesopotamia. Every modern invention, every scientific breakthrough, every technological advance reflects their fundamental insight that human intelligence can triumph over natural limitations. The political institutions that govern modern societies show clear Mesopotamian influence. The concept of written law, established by Hammurabi and his predecessors, remains the foundation of every legal system. The idea that rulers should be bound by law, that justice should be predictable and impartial, that legal procedures should be public and transparent, all these principles were first articulated in Mesopotamian law codes. The administrative techniques that make possible the governance of large populations were developed by Mesopotamian rulers who faced the unprecedented challenge of managing cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants. The idea of professional civil service, of systematic record-keeping, of regular taxation based on careful assessment of resources. All these innovations were necessitated by the scale of Mesopotamian society. Even the concept of international law has Mesopotamian origins. The treaties that governed relations between Mesopotamian city-states established precedents for diplomatic procedure that continue to influence international relations. The idea that agreements between states should be written down, witnessed by the gods, and binding on successors was their innovation. The economic systems that organize modern production and distribution rest on Mesopotamian foundations. The concept of private property, protected by law and transferable through sale or inheritance, was first clearly articulated in Mesopotamian legal codes. The institution of banking, with its practices of lending, borrowing, and interest calculation, was developed by Mesopotamian merchants and temple administrators. The market mechanisms that regulate supply and demand, the commercial practices that facilitate trade, the accounting methods that track profit and loss, all these techniques were pioneered by Mesopotamian businessmen who faced the challenge of managing complex economic relationships in an increasingly sophisticated society. Labor specialization, which allows modern societies to achieve high levels of productivity and innovation, was first systematically organized in Mesopotamian cities. The guild system that trained craftsmen, the professional associations that maintained standards, the apprenticeship programs that transmitted skills, all these institutions have Mesopotamian precedents. The insurance industry, which manages risk in modern economic life, descended from practices first developed by Mesopotamian merchants who needed protection against the hazards of long-distance trade. The principle of shared risk, where many contribute small amounts to protect against large losses, was their insight. Even modern corporate organization shows Mesopotamian influence. The temple estates of ancient Mesopotamia were among history's first large-scale economic institutions, employing thousands of workers in specialized roles under centralized management. The organizational techniques they developed for coordinating complex activities across multiple locations provided models for later business enterprises. The social institutions that structure human relationships in modern societies often reflect patterns established in ancient Mesopotamia. The nuclear family, consisting of parents and children as the basic social unit, was strengthened and legalized by Mesopotamian family law. The legal protection of marriage contracts, the regulation of divorce procedures, the establishment of inheritance rights, all these innovations helped create stable family structures that could function effectively in urban environments. Educational institutions that extend learning beyond the family also have Mesopotamian origins. The idea that society should establish schools to teach specialized knowledge, that education should be available to children beyond the elite, that learning should include both practical skills and cultural transmission. All these concepts were developed in Mesopotamian temple schools. Professional associations that regulate skilled occupations trace their ancestry to Mesopotamian guilds. The idea that practitioners of a craft should establish standards, train newcomers, and protect the interests of their members was first systematically implemented by Mesopotamian artisans and merchants. Even modern concepts of social welfare have Mesopotamian precedents. the responsibility of rulers to provide for the poor and disadvantaged, articulated in the prologues to Mesopotamian law codes, establish principles of social justice that continue to influence political thought. The cultural institutions that enrich human life show equally clear Mesopotamian influence. Public festivals that bring communities together in celebration descend from the great religious festivals of ancient Mesopotamia. These events, which combined religious observance with public entertainment, social bonding, and cultural display, provided models for community celebration that persist today. The performing arts that entertain and inspire modern audiences have ancient Mesopotamian roots. The epic recitations that entertained audiences in ancient palaces and temples were the ancestors of modern theatre. The musical performances that accompanied religious ceremonies evolved into the concert traditions that continue today. Even sports and games show Mesopotamian influence. The competitive contests that were part of ancient festivals, the board games that provided entertainment for the wealthy, the physical competitions that tested strength and skill, all these activities provided precedents for modern recreational culture. The intellectual traditions that guide modern thought bear deep Mesopotamian imprints. Philosophy, as a systematic inquiry into fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and ethics, had important Mesopotamian predecessors. The wisdom literature produced by Mesopotamian scribes addressed many of the same questions that continue to occupy philosophers today. Historical thinking, which attempts to understand the present through careful study of the past, was pioneered by Mesopotamian chroniclers who first began keeping systematic records of political and religious events. Their insight that human actions have consequences that extend across generations laid the foundation for all subsequent historical inquiry. Mathematical reasoning, which seeks to discover universal principles through logical analysis, was developed by Mesopotamian scholars who first recognized that numerical relationships could reveal underlying patterns in natural phenomena. Their work provided the foundation for the mathematical sciences that make modern technology possible. Astronomical thinking, which sees the Earth as part of a larger cosmic system governed by discoverable laws, emerged from the patient observations of Mesopotamian star watchers. Their recognition that celestial phenomena follow predictable patterns provided the foundation for the scientific worldview that guides modern research. The artistic traditions that beautify human life show pervasive Mesopotamian influence. Narrative art, which tells stories through visual images, was perfected by Mesopotamian sculptors and painters who decorated palaces and temples with elaborate historical and mythological scenes. Their techniques for organizing complex compositions, for conveying emotion through gesture and expression, for using symbolic elements to enhance meaning. All these innovations influenced subsequent artistic development. Decorative art, which enhances functional objects with beautiful ornament, reached high levels of sophistication in Mesopotamian workshops. The patterns and motifs they developed, geometric designs, animal figures, plant forms, continue to appear in decorative arts around the world. Monumental sculpture, which commemorates important people and events through large-scale artistic works, was essentially a Mesopotamian invention. Their understanding of how sculptural forms could convey power, authority, and religious significance influenced artistic traditions throughout the ancient world and beyond. The literary traditions that shape modern culture draw continuously from Mesopotamian sources. Epic poetry, which celebrates heroic achievements and explores fundamental human experiences, reached its first mature form in Mesopotamian literature. The structural techniques they developed, the use of repeated epithets, the organization of episodes around central themes, the integration of mythological and historical material, influenced epic traditions in many cultures. Lyric poetry, which expresses personal emotions and experiences, also has important Mesopotamian precedents. The love songs, laments, and hymns composed by Mesopotamian poets establish patterns of imagery, rhythm, and emotional expression that continue to influence poetic traditions. Prose narrative, which tells stories in ordinary language rather than verse, was developed by Mesopotamian scribes who wrote historical chronicles, legal documents, and administrative records. Their techniques for organizing narrative material, for creating coherent accounts of complex events, for balancing detail with overview, provided models for later prose writers. Even the concept of authorship itself has Mesopotamian origins. The idea that literary works should be attributed to individual creators, that writers should take personal responsibility for their compositions, that literary achievement should bring fame and recognition. All these concepts were developed by Mesopotamian authors who first began signing their works. The religious traditions that continue to shape human spirituality show profound Mesopotamian influence. The concept of divine transcendence, that gods exist beyond the physical world but can intervene in human affairs, was articulated by Mesopotamian theologians who wrestled with questions about the relationship between the human and divine realms. The practice of prayer as formal communication between humans and gods was systematized by Mesopotamian priests who developed elaborate liturgies for different occasions and purposes. Their understanding of how ritual language could create sacred space and facilitate divine contact influenced religious practices in many traditions. The institution of priesthood, with its specialized training, hierarchical organization, and professional responsibilities, was essentially a Mesopotamian creation. Their insight that religious functions should be performed by trained specialists who devoted their lives to sacred service provided a model for religious organization that spread throughout the ancient world. Theological thinking, which attempts to understand divine nature and purposes through systematic inquiry, emerged from the sophisticated religious speculation of Mesopotamian scholars. Their efforts to reconcile divine omnipotence with human suffering, to understand the relationship between fate and free will, to explain the role of religion in social order, all these investigations provided foundations for later theological development. The ethical traditions that guide human behavior show clear Mesopotamian origins. The concept of universal moral law, that certain principles of right and wrong apply to all people regardless of social status, was first articulated in Mesopotamian legal and wisdom literature. Their insight that justice should be impartial and that rulers should be held to moral standards influenced ethical thinking for millennia. The idea of personal moral responsibility, that individuals are accountable for their actions and should strive to live virtuous lives, was developed by Mesopotamian moralists who wrote extensively about proper conduct in both private and public life. Their understanding that ethical behavior requires both knowledge of right principles and the will to follow them provided a foundation for subsequent moral philosophy. Even modern concepts of human rights have ancient Mesopotamian precedents. The protection of the weak against the strong, the right to fair treatment under law, the responsibility of governments to serve their people's welfare. All these ideas appear in Mesopotamian legal and political texts. The scientific traditions that guide modern research show pervasive Mesopotamian influence. Empirical observation, which gathers knowledge through careful study of natural phenomena, was systematized by Mesopotamian scholars who maintained detailed records of astronomical, meteorological, and medical observations over many centuries. Experimental method, which tests hypotheses through controlled procedures, had important Mesopotamian predecessors in the work of physicians who systematically tried different treatments, and recorded their results. Their insight that knowledge should be based on evidence rather than tradition provided a foundation for subsequent scientific development. Mathematical modeling, which uses numerical relationships to understand natural processes, was pioneered by Mesopotamian astronomers who developed sophisticated calculations to predict celestial events. Their recognition that mathematics could reveal hidden patterns in natural phenomena influenced the development of mathematical physics. The technological traditions that shape modern material culture rest on Mesopotamian foundations. Engineering design, which applies scientific principles to solve practical problems, emerged from the work of Mesopotamian builders who constructed complex irrigation systems, massive buildings, and sophisticated machines. Industrial organization, which coordinates the production of goods on a large scale, was first systematized by Mesopotamian administrators who managed temple workshops employing hundreds of specialized workers. Their techniques for organizing production, maintaining quality standards, and distributing finished goods provided models for later industrial development. Innovation processes which systematically improve existing technologies and develop new ones were established by Mesopotamian craftsmen who continuously refined their techniques and shared knowledge with apprentices and colleagues. Their understanding that technology could be improved through systematic effort created a culture of innovation that continues today. As we trace these countless connections between ancient Mesopotamia and modern civilization, we begin to understand the true magnitude of their achievement. They did not merely create the first cities, the first writing systems, the first law codes. They established the fundamental patterns of thought and behavior that make complex civilization possible. Their greatest insight was perhaps the recognition that human beings could transcend their biological limitations through cooperation, organization, and accumulated knowledge. Before their time, human societies were constrained by the size of kinship groups and the range of personal relationships. The Mesopotamians discovered that much larger groups could function effectively if they developed appropriate institutions and technologies. This discovery that social organization could extend human capabilities was perhaps the most important breakthrough in human history. It made possible not only the impressive achievements of Mesopotamian civilization itself, but all subsequent developments in human culture and technology. The institutions they created to manage large-scale cooperation, written communication, formal law, professional administration, systematic education, provided the foundation for every subsequent civilization. The technologies they developed to increase human productivity, metallurgy, agriculture, construction, transportation, established patterns of innovation that continue today. The intellectual frameworks they developed to understand the world, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, provided the foundation for all subsequent scientific and scholarly inquiry. The artistic and literary traditions they established continue to influence human creativity and expression. Perhaps most importantly, they established the fundamental optimism about human possibilities that characterizes civilization. They believed that problems could be solved, that life could be improved, that the future could be better than the past. This confidence in human capability, born in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, continues to drive human achievement today. As the night deepens and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, the legacy of Mesopotamia surrounds us still. In the city lights that banish darkness, in the technologies that connect us across vast distances, in the institutions that organize our common life, in the knowledge that guides our understanding. Everywhere we look, we see the fruits of seeds planted between the rivers so long ago. Their voices have been silent for millennia. Their cities have crumbled into dust. Their languages have been forgotten by all but scholars. Yet their greatest creation, the idea of civilization itself, lives on in every human community that chooses cooperation over conflict, knowledge over ignorance, hope over despair. The story that began with the first farmers who settled along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates continues today in every classroom where children learn to read, in every laboratory where researchers seek new knowledge, in every courthouse where justice is dispensed, in every library where wisdom is preserved. The ancient dream of Gilgamesh to accomplish deeds that will be remembered forever has been fulfilled not by any individual hero, but by the collective achievement of human civilization. The immortality that the ancient kings sought through personal fame has been achieved through the institutions, technologies, and ideas that outlive their creators. In the end, the greatest monument to ancient Mesopotamia is not any physical structure, however magnificent, but the continuing vitality of the civilization they began. Every time human beings choose to work together rather than apart, to preserve knowledge rather than let it perish, to hope for the future rather than despair of it, they honor the memory of those ancient pioneers who first glimpsed the possibilities that cooperation and organization could create. The rivers that gave birth to the first cities continue to flow, carrying their ancient waters to the sea. The stars that guided the first astronomers continue to wheel overhead in their eternal dance. The human spirit that first dared to dream of cities and laws and written words continues to seek new ways to transcend the limitations of time and space and mortality. The story of Mesopotamia is ultimately the story of human possibility, a testament to what can be achieved when intelligence is joined with determination, when individual talent is multiplied by collective effort, when the lessons of the past are used to build a better future. In this sense, their story never ends, but continues to unfold in every generation that inherits and extends their legacy. And so, as sleep approaches and consciousness fades into dreams, we can rest knowing that we are part of a great continuity that stretches back to the dawn of civilization. The same stars that shone down on the first cities shine down on us today. The same human hopes and fears that move the hearts of ancient peoples move our hearts as well. The same fundamental questions about meaning and purpose that occupied ancient minds continue to challenge us. We are all citizens of the civilization that began between the rivers, all inheritors of the vision that first conceived of human society as something greater than the sum of its parts. In our successes and failures, our discoveries and losses, our hopes and fears, we continue the great experiment in human possibility that began with the first settlement beside the flowing waters of Mesopotamia, where civilization was born, and where, in a sense, it continues to be reborn, with each new generation that takes up the eternal task of building a world worthy of human dreams.